Nice, nice. We have a lot of crowd from so many places already.
Hi everyone, we'll be starting in couple of minutes. Meanwhile, those who are joining from YouTube, please make use of the chat box and type where you're joining from. And also all of you who are joining on Zoom, please type where you're joining from. It will be nice to know where you're all joining from. So we have people joining from Ladakh, from Mizoram, Bhopal, and Haryana, Pune. Anybody else from northeastern states?
I saw Manipur, which is nice.
Yeah. And Ashwin, since you're there, and I'm gonna make you the co-host. And please do let us know if there are any questions coming on YouTube chat.
Nagaland, nice. Hello.
Another 2-3 minutes, we still have more people joining in. We have people joining from everywhere. We have people joining from Manipal. We are joining from Malda, Karnataka, Assam, Nagaland, Ladakh, Chhattisgarh. Okay, shall we start?
Yes, I think we have good attendance. 40 people almost. Nice. A few more people are joining. So will you guys check out the waiting room when
Yeah,
I close the box? Okay,
yeah,
done. All right.
yeah. So I'm going to start with the introduction. Ashwin, could you please admit people in the waiting room? All right. So welcome everyone. Good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining for today's webinar. We are so happy to see so many people interested in Northeast birds, and we have the perfect speaker who has spent a considerable amount of time. Sorry, let me just mute the YouTube.
Oh, a lot of people joining now. Nice. Okay, admitted.
Can you still hear me?
Yes, I can hear you guys.
Can you still hear me, Ronit?
Yeah, can you guys hear me? My voice is audible, right?
Yes,
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 but is my voice
Okay.
audible?
yes.
Yes, yes, I can hear you guys quite well.
Oh, yeah. I think I'm breaking up. Just a minute. I will just check my audio and come back.
Perfect. Yeah. Ooh, 50 people on the Zoom, almost. Nice. Not bad.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I'm really
Ronit,
sorry. I think there was some.
Yep.
you may need to reshare your screen because of there's a line that's come, an
Oh yeah,
annotation.
I do not know why that happened.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'll just turn that setting off.
Okay, let me stop sharing and then share my screen again.
Just give me a second. Um,
Okay. So while Ronit is resharing his screen,
Hmm.
yeah, once again, welcome everyone. And before we start, we would request all of you to keep your microphones muted and please feel free to use the chat box for any questions during the presentation. We'll take them towards the end of the talk. And those who are joining from YouTube, please continue asking your questions, or if you have any comments or anecdotes to share, please do it in the YouTube chat box. This session will be recorded and we will soon be sharing the recording. Let me introduce to our speaker for today. We have Ronit. Ronit has been fascinated with the natural world for as long as he can remember, particularly with birds and snakes and amphibians. He completed his master's degree in the wildlife biology and conservation at NCBS Bangalore, and he specialized. He studied vocal networks in birding community in Namdapha in Arunachal. And currently he works with NCF with Bird Count India, analyzing eBird data sets to generate interesting information regarding bird population trends in India. And in his free time, he enjoys bird watching, going looking for snakes, and playing tennis. So without any further delay, I'll hand over this session to Ronit. And over to you, Ronit.
Yeah, I hope everyone can hear me now as well. Thank you, Mital, for the introduction, and thanks everybody for taking time off of your schedules to attend the webinar today. It's quite an honor to actually be able to spread the joy of birds and birding in Northeast India to all of you, and I really hope that it's going to be a fun learning experience for many of you who've probably never birded in Northeast India before. So, if you're someone who's not familiar with the birds in Northeast India, I have to tell you that there's a very good chance that on your first birding experience, that you'll probably be completely overwhelmed by the incredible bird diversity in the hill forests of the Northeast. It's kind of the equivalent of being thrown into a 20-foot pool without knowing how to swim, and there's weights attached to both your legs, and the pool's infested with sharks. But the main goal of today's webinar would probably be to ease your pain a little, and maybe instead of throwing you into the shark infested pool, maybe we could gently lower you into the pool while giving you some tips on how to swim. And how do I plan to do that today? Well, the idea is to take you on a nice drive through on a winter morning in a typical hillside in Northeast India, and all the way from the foothills to the higher altitudes. And we'll keep stopping at these different habitats at different elevations to show you what common birds you can expect to see on your journey. And that way, we thought it'll be a little more intuitive when you start looking for these birds in these habitats by yourself. So, a bit of a disclaimer and some background on Northeast India before I start off. And right off the bat, I'd like to apologize beforehand to all of you because I've noticed that different people's perceptions of what a common bird is seems to vary a lot based on where you're birding. And the birds I've included in my presentation are certainly not an exhaustive list of every common bird in the Northeast. So please do bear with me if I missed a few birds. It's probably because I either forgot to add them or didn't have enough space to include them in the presentation today. We're also quite limiting our birds to the common hill birds of Northeast India, even though the Northeast does have a very cool range of interesting habitats, and we just don't have enough time to cover all of them in today's webinar. And if you look at the terrain of Northeast India on the right, you'll notice that almost 70% of it is just covered in hills, which makes hill birding a very important part and parcel of birding over here. And like I've mentioned before, the diversity here is crazy, and species appear and disappear so quickly while you move up and down the elevational gradient. So now to start off in your journey, you're in the plains, you hop into your car and drive off into the hills, and you reach the low elevation in the foothills between say 200 and 800 meters. So you and since in the foothills in many regions are quite heavily populated, you'll notice a lot of forest has been converted to things like cultivation and scrub patches of and scattered secondary forest. Jume cultivation, which is a method of shifting slash and burn cultivation, is really popular in these regions, and you'll also find some interesting birds in these scrubby hillside low elevation habitats. The first one being the pinstripe tit babbler, which is a very common tiny babbler that you find in the lowland forests of northeast India. And a very important pointer to identify this species, which is kind of a skulker and moves very quickly through the forest, is the lines on the throat. It has a lot of streaking on its throat and a slightly yellowish supercilium that you can immediately look at and say, yes, this is a pinstripe tit babbler, and tell it apart from the other similar looking babblers and other small birds in the region. We also have the rufous fronted babbler or the buff chested babbler, which has been split from another congener called the rufous cap babbler. And you can immediately identify this by its very bright orangish colored cap and white sides to its face. Again, it's a very tiny bird and loves to hide in the undergrowth, but sometimes it does venture out into the open. And when you see one, you can identify it by its very orangish rufusy cap and the rest of its very drab looking brown body. We have birds like the buff-breasted babbler and Abbott's babbler in northeast India. And the buff-breasted babbler is actually one of my favorite birds in the northeast because it's a bird that everybody completely overlooks. It's a bird that no one's ever, like many people have never heard of. Its calls are so easy to miss because they sound exactly like a common tailor bird. And if you look at this bird, it just has no features that are striking or anything that you could possibly identify it by. It's just a plain brown looking bird that likes to skulk around in the undergrowth, and you barely ever get to see it in the open. But do look out for its calls that sound like a common tailor bird, and it just completely continues and go on for minutes together. The Abbott's babbler is another very interesting babbler in the foothill forests. And you can identify this by the rufous wash to its belly, slightly whitish supercilium and whitish throat, which makes it a little more pattern than the buff-breasted babbler. And you can also identify it by its three-note call that it gives off while it's in the undergrowth in these secondary forests, and it does venture into primary growth forests as well. We have the shrikes, the grey-backed shrike and the long-tailed shrike in these open environments in the hill forests of northeast India. And the grey-backed shrike, like its name suggests, is the only shrike in the region with a completely grey back and rufous underparts and a blackish mask, which helps you tell it apart from most other shrikes in the region. And of course, the long-tailed shrike, which is a slightly more tricky bird to identify because it comes in different subspecies, which are very different in appearance. And the most common one would be the tricolored subspecies, which you can see in the photo on the right, which has a completely black cap, a rufous back and rufous underparts, and quite a long tail, as the name suggests. So these two are the very common shrikes that you find in these slightly degraded habitats in the foothills. Grey bush chat, another bush chat of the lowland forests in winter in northeast India. They actually breed in the higher altitudes and kind of descend to the lower altitudes in winter, where you can find them in a range of open habitats. You can see they are quite dimorphic, with the male being black and gray and nicely patterned, and the female has more brown on it. Rufous nest laughing thrush is a very beautiful laughing thrush of these habitats, and it's very immediately identifiable by the rufous ear coverts and a black face and red eyes, and it's extremely striking bird that you find moving through the forest in secondary growth in like very loud, noisy groups. So this bird is really hard to miss if it's in your vicinity, and even if you see it for a moment, you can very easily identify it. Some of the barbets in the lowland forests are, again, extremely easy to see and hear. And one of them is the great barbet. It's not only found in the foothill forests, but all the way up to the high elevations where you can see trees. Great barbets are found across the elevational gradient, and you can immediately identify them by their massive size and their black heads. They mainly feed on fruits, unlike the other birds that I just introduced you to. So you'll find them very often on fruiting trees and things like that. The blue-throated barbet, on the other hand, is very common again in hill forests. You'll hear them throughout the day. And it's immediately recognizable by the blue wash to its face and the reddish crown that many of the other barbets also have. But the blue wash to the face is what you use it to separate from other barbets in this elevation in particular. You also have a sparrow called the Eurasian tree sparrow that's super abundant in these habitats. And you can separate it from the house sparrow, which a lot of people confuse it with, by the white spot, I mean, the black spot on its cheek. So the male and female look pretty similar in the sparrow, which is quite unique to sparrows. And you can immediately identify it by its brownish crown and the black spot on the sides of its cheek. It's extremely abundant in these habitats, and you'll usually find it in these secondary growth forests or like open areas next to villages and agricultural habitats in the hills. And now we move on to low elevation hill streams and rivers. These are very unique habitats because there's water and lots of rocks. And now, before I move on, I'll give you guys a minute to type in the chat box what species you'd expect to see here. And then we can continue. Because a lot of unique species that you guys might have heard of occur in these low elevation hill streams. I'd like to, before we move on, maybe for a minute, we can look at what species you can expect to find. You can type this in the chat box and I will reveal it a little later. Nice. We have folktails, we have redstarts, we have flycatchers. Interesting. Some people have put dippers. Yes, yes, yes. Oh, we have some wagtails. That's also yeah, wagtails you will find, but not very unique to the Northeast, I guess. Yeah. A lot of people saying folktails, nice. Crested kingfisher, that's a nice one. But again, I think it's a bit of a wider river species. You don't find it in the smaller streams and the medium-sized rivers. So yeah, a lot of good responses. And here's one of the some people did mention redstart, so well done. So plumbeous water redstart and white-cap redstart are two of these birds that you will always find next to water. Like every single time you see a stream, you'd be almost entirely sure to find a plumbeous redstart and a white-cap redstart. So plumbeous redstarts are quite dimorphic. You can see the bigger picture on the left is the male. It's kind of slaty blue with a very bright orangey rufous tail. And the female looks quite different, even though it's structurally the same bird. It has a whitish tail and a lot of mottling on its underparts, and it just looks gray overall. But you can also identify it very readily by its habitat, and it also has this behavior of just like sitting on these rocks and just fanning its tail outwards. So when you see a redstart that looks quite plump and tiny and behaves like this, you can immediately say it is a plumbeous redstart quite confidently. White-capped redstart's another striking bird that's almost unmistakable. Males and females are also quite alike. And it has this beautiful white cap and a contrasting black head and rufusy red underparts and tail, which you can't mistake for any single bird in the region. So that's one bird that's extremely abundant along these hill streams, not just in Northeast India, but across the Himalayas. Spotted forktail, another beautiful large forktail that you find in hill streams along running water. And these spotted forktails typically prefer the larger streams with a decent amount of shade on either side. And you'll also find them across the Himalayas and not just in the Northeast. These forktails are probably one of the most common forktails in Northeast India. So I decided to include these in the presentation as well. But we do have some other folktales that are a little more unique to Northeast India, like the slaty-backed and the black-backed folktale. So as their names suggest, you can identify the slaty and black-backed folktales by the color of their backs. The slaty-backed folktale, of course, has a slightly grayer back than the black-backed. And you also see some separation in their habitat preferences, with the slaty-backed folktale preferring a little more wider, more wide streams with flowing water, and black-backed folktales you can also find just next to flowing water on roads and things like that in the lower elevations of Northeast India. An extremely abundant bird, not just in Northeast India, but throughout the Himalayas, would be your blue whistling thrush, and also has a very high preference for these hill streams. You can immediately identify it by its very striking yellow bill and these very glossy patterns on its coat and markings. And it's just an omnipresent bird throughout the Northeast and the rest of the Himalayas. Now, finally, after you've done birding in the evergreen forest, now you move on to a really nice patch of primary evergreen forest in the low elevations. It's completely pristine, undisturbed, and you also find some very nice old trees and undergrowth, and all of that. So quickly, in a minute, could you guys tell me in the chat box what kind of species you would expect to see in these low elevation tropical rainforests? Ashwin says blackback folktail sounds exactly like large bill wheat warbler. Has anyone felt this? Yeah, it actually does. Yes, getting a lot of answers. Jordan's bars are okay, interesting. Unfortunately, I haven't really included too many raptors in this presentation because none of them are too unique to the Northeast. I see Yuhinas, cupwings, and wren babblers. Interesting. Wren babblers are technically not common in the Northeast, but yeah, take that. Laughing thrushes, yes. Meteors, yes. Few owls, interesting. Someone says Trogon, magpies. Oh, magpies. Yes, someone also says flycatchers. So many of you already guessed most of the species that I'll be telling you about in these low elevation tropical forests. And wait, my slides. Yeah, one of them, I don't think many of you guessed this, but a very common bird in the low elevation forests of Northeast India and the hill forests would be your gray peacock pheasant. Immediately recognizable if you see it, but the problem is you'll probably never see it because it's an extremely skulky bird, always keeps to like dense vegetation and almost never ventures out into the open. But when it does, you'll notice that both males and sometimes female, actually males, have these very cool peacock-like patterns on their back, and then the feathers or kind of look like the spots that you would see on a peacock's back. Males also have this overhanging crest that you see and white cheeks, so they're quite immediately recognizable. And also by call, because I think you'd hear this bird way more often than you see it, and it has a very hoarse kind of call that if you learn to recognize, you'll start hearing it and spotting it in many different places that you might not have noticed them in before. Another woodpecker, a massive woodpecker of these northeast hill forests, would be the bay woodpecker. So males and females are slightly dimorphic, with males having a red nape and females being overall brown with a darkish back with a lot of brown streaks. And these birds are also much bigger than any other woodpecker in the region and immediately recognizable. They're also extremely loud. You can hear their call just echoing across a valley in these hill forests. Oh, I think someone's disagreeing with the, no, okay. We'll let them mute it and, yeah, okay, they're muted. Greater yellownape, another lowland foothill woodpecker, which is quite large. The males and females, again, quite dimorphic, with the males having a whitish throat and some streaks and all of that. And they are quite large while compared to your wait, I have the, yeah, there's also a lesser yellownape. So you can tell the difference between the greater and the lesser yellownape just by size, by looking at the streaking on the throat. And of course, as the name suggests, both of them have yellowish napes, but the lesser yellownape also has more red on the crown. So we move on to our fulvous-breasted woodpecker, another very common black and white woodpecker in these lowland evergreen forests, and probably one of the only black and white woodpeckers that you see in the lowland forests compared to mid elevations where they become much more common. So the male has a quite reddish cap, and females have completely black caps and a lot of black and white barring on their backs and a reddish vent, which you can help differentiate them from other woodpeckers in the region. Rufous woodpecker is another easy bird to identify. Completely brown, does not have any kind of contrast anywhere on its body except for the slight barring on its back. So one of the birds that also frequents mixed species bird flocks and other woodpecker flocks in the lowland hill forests of northeast India. Lesser yellownape I have already taken you through, but look at how drastically different they are structurally from the greater yellownape. They have a blackish bill, which is much weaker than the greaters, and overall it's a much tinier bird and also participates in all these mixed species flocks quite often. We have the blue-eared barbet. So unlike the other two barbets which I took you through, which you can find in all kinds of forests, including degraded forests, these blue-eared barbets also prefer very pristine evergreen forests with extremely tall trees. And they actually have this habit of sitting right at the tops of these 100-foot tall trees and calling from there. And they're actually quite difficult to spot because you're right under them in the foliage and you might not be able to see them too well. But blue-eared barbets can be told apart from blue-throated barbets by the red cheek patch right under the eye and the red malar stripe, which differentiates them. They're also a little smaller than your other barbets in this region. We also have two broadbills, very striking looking birds, the long-tailed broadbill and the grey-lobed broadbill. It used to be called the silver-breasted broadbill. There's a bit of confusion with taxonomy, with people confusing them with the silver-breasted broadbill still. But the one we find in our region would be the grey-lobed broadbill. Again, very striking birds. You can't possibly confuse these two with anything else, with the long-tailed broadbill also being called the helmet bird in a lot of places. And even their vocalizations are very distinct. So if you hear them in the forest, you will know that they are long-tailed broadbills. And they tend to move with these mixed species flocks as well. So when you encounter a flock of slightly medium-sized canopy birds, you will also probably encounter these two broadbills. Scarlet minivets are like very beautiful looking minivets of the lower stories in the hill forests. Males and females are extremely dimorphic. And a lot of people I found have a lot of trouble trying to identify these minivets because the males and females kind of look alike, and the males of scarlet minivets don't look too different from other minivets like the long-tail minivet. But I think the best way to tell these minivets apart would not just be looking at them, but you'll also have to look at their calls because all of these minivets have drastically different calls, with the scarlet minivet having a slightly quicker and no more melodious call, and the long-tail minivets having slightly a few more notes on their calls. So don't identify minivets by just looking at them, but identify them by their vocalizations because they're almost always vocalizing too while they move in flocks through the forest. And you also find these two together in flocks very often. So it's hard to identify an individual in a flock and then say all the other individuals are of the same species, but they might not be. Oh, someone else is okay, muted. Right. Yeah. So we also have a couple of very cool looking pigeons called green pigeons in Northeast India, and also a lot of other green pigeons in the rest of the country. But these two green pigeons, the wedge-tailed green pigeons and pin-tailed green pigeon, are extremely abundant in the lowland evergreen foothill forests of Northeast India. You can easily tell them apart by the color of their back and also their tails. The pin-tailed green pigeon, like the name suggests, has a very pointed graduated tail, while the wedge tail has a very thick tail that just ends in a rounded sort of way, and it's also greenish in color. We have some cibias in the lowland evergreen forest that descend in elevation in winters, and you can find them around these lowland foothill forests. One of them is the long-tailed cibia. This one's hard to miss because it's so extremely vocal in these lowland forests. They also have this white patch on their wings that makes them a little different from other cibias. And we also have a beautiful cibia. I do not know if it's aptly named because it's just a solid grayish bird with dark lobes and some other patterning on its wings. But it does look pretty cool when you see it flying through a forest with these flocks and their specific groups. Both of these cibias are extremely noisy, and you pick them up almost immediately if they're around. One of the other pigeons in the region would be the mountain imperial pigeon, another bird that you might not see very often when it's perched, but you'll see them flying across valleys very often. And you can identify them very quickly by their pale head with their whitish iris and a very pink bill. And unlike many of the other pigeons in the region, they're not very patterned. You can see like a solid brown on their backs and a solid creamy white on the head, and you will immediately know that it is a mountain imperial pigeon. We also have some flycatchers and robins in these lower elevations that descend from the hills in winters. And one of them would be our white-tailed robin. Again, the white, like the name suggests, the white on the tail is diagnostic, but it's not always visible because these birds are extremely skulky. So you can identify them by their calls, which they often emit from dense vegetation. And if you're lucky, they do hop into the open sometimes, and you might be able to see them. Hill blue flycatcher is another very common blue flycatcher in the region. And this Cyornis complex, in fact, is a complex of a lot of very similar looking blue flycatchers. And the blue flycatcher is the one that we find in the Northeast. So if birders in the rest of peninsular India are familiar with the Tickle's blue flycatcher, it might look extremely similar to the Tickle's blue flycatcher. But if you are birding in the Northeast, you do not, like Tickle's blue flycatchers don't uh, are not found in the Northeast. It is the hill blue flycatcher that replaces this in the Northeast. So you're more likely to see a hill blue flycatcher. We also have birds like the blue flycatcher from the Cyornis complex, and these are slightly easier to identify because the throats are blue. Unlike in the hill blue flycatcher, where the orange extends right to the base of the bill, in the hill blue flycatchers, they have almost an entirely blue throat, with some of them having a slight orange notch up their throat, but it doesn't reach right to the base of their chin. So again, readily identifiable by that. Males and females are dimorphic, with females with having like a bit of orange wash to the breast and they look quite similar to other female flycatchers of the region as well. So they're a bit tricky to identify, but by elevation and by time of the year, you can narrow them down quite a bit. We have our pale blue flycatcher, again extremely dimorphic, with the males having pale shade of blue and some white underparts, which helps you separate it from another similar flycatcher called the Verditer flycatcher. Males and females are quite different. Females are just a dull shade of brown and can be told apart from other flycatchers just by their structure. They're a little more elongated than you would used to be seeing in the other Cyrus flycatchers. Snowy-browed flycatcher, another very compact flycatcher that keeps to the undergrowth in lowland evergreen forests. You can readily identify them by their whitish brow on the males and their slaty blue backs and rufous breasts. And females are again in many of these flycatchers, they're a drab brown in color. So again, a little tricky to identify, but you'll also have to look at the structure. These birds are quite round and also have very pale legs. So you might be able to use those to identify them. Again, the bills in these snowy browed flycatchers are also less strong than you would expect in another Siamese flycatcher like the blue flycatcher, which have very strong bills. Small niltawas are also these interesting flycatchers that you find in sometimes in lowland and mid-elevation forests as well. And small niltawa is one of them. You can readily tell this apart from other flycatchers in the region by their bluish shoulder patches and stunted bills. And to me, niltawas are quite different from the other flycatchers just by looking at the structure of the head. So if you look at other flycatchers, they kind of have a sloping, graduated, curved head, while small niltawas actually have very flat heads. So structurally, when you look at a bird, a flycatcher in this region, and it has a very flat, graduating sort of slope between the bill and the rest of the head, you will know that it's a niltawa and not another flycatcher. Another pale-chinned flycatcher is another flycatcher in the Cyrus complex, but unlike the other blue flycatchers, it's much easier to identify because it has no hint of blue on it. The males and females look pretty similar to each other, and the backs are just a solid brown in color with grayish cheeks. Even these are quite skulky like other flycatchers, but they do venture out into the open where you can see them from time to time. Gray-headed canary flycatchers are these striking little birds that are very often found in mixed species bird flocks in winters, and you can readily identify them by their grayish heads, and the rest of their bodies are quite yellowish. They're not similar looking to anything else in the region. Nepal fulvetters, another very common participant of mixed species bird flocks in this region. So if you do encounter a mixed species bird flocks, you're almost sure to encounter birds like Nepal fulvetters and gray-headed canary flycatchers together. And Nepal fulvetters are just very readily recognizable by the whitish ring, the very thick whitish ring around their eyes and their brown backs, and the black eyebrow that just goes along right to the back. White-bellied aircornis is another very common bird in these lowland evergreen forests, and it does look quite distinct. It kind of looks like a miniature bulbul of sorts because it does have a crest, which you don't see in too many birds that look similar to the aircornis, and they have these very pale bills, yellowish backs, and white bellies that you can use to tell them apart from other birds in the region. Again, very common participants in mixed species bird flocks in the region. The lesser racket-tailed drongo is another drongo of these forests, and again, it's quite unmistakable because of the rackets on its tail, but you can tell it apart from the greater racket-tailed drongo, which is another drongo in the region, just by the shape of the head. Again, a very gradual sloping forehead, and they don't really have a crest at the base of the bill, which can help you to tell them apart from the greater racket-tailed drongo. We also have a lot of warblers, and everyone really does not like identifying warblers, but we do have birds like the blight-sleeve warbler and the yellow-browed warbler, which you most probably do have to identify by call if you're not too aware of how warblers look. We have birds in the golden spectacled warbler complex, which is, currently Philoscopus too, but we have our white spectacled and gray-cheeked warblers, which have a lot of gray on the crown. But you can see the extent of gray is quite different between white spectacled and gray-crowned warblers, gray-cheeked warblers. Chestnut-crowned and rufous-faced warblers are two other warblers in the region. They both have a bit of rufous on the face, but you can easily tell them apart by their striking colors. Chestnut-crown only has a rufous crown, and the rest of its cheeks are grayish. The silver-eared mesia, another very striking, very common bird of these lowland evergreen forests. They travel through the forest in these huge groups, and as you can see, they're quite immediately recognizable by the silver ears and the black caps, and they're very strikingly patterned as well. Striated and black-chinned ewena are two other ewenas in the lowland evergreen forest. And you can tell the black-chinned ewena by the black lores that it has in the crest. And striated ewenas also have this brown cheek patch that you can use to tell them apart from other similar-looking ewenas in the forest. They also participate in these mixed species bird flocks a lot. Laughing thrushes, moving from small birds to the large birds in these forests, we have our lesser and greater necklace laughing thrush. They tend to flock together in mixed species bird flocks, so you can't really see them separately a lot in winters. But you can tell them apart because the great necklace laughing thrush has a completely enclosed white cheek patch and the two black lines running along its face, while the lesser necklace laughing thrush just has a single eye stripe. So it doesn't really make a complete ear cover. We have the common hill myna, which is extremely common across different parts of the lowland forests in Northeast India. Again, you can find it in all these huge fruiting trees in winters and in summers. They're quite common over all parts of the Northeast. And they're also readily recognizable by the pattern of the yellow wattles on their face and the very striking orange bill. Orange-bellied leaf birds, again, very common birds in these elevations. You can readily identify the male by the orange belly and the blue on the face, and the females are slightly different with a more greenish orange belly and still an amount of blue on its face. They're quite striking and easy to identify. Red-headed trogons, again, if you see it, you probably never misidentify it. And males have a completely red head, females have a brownish head, but both of them are very strikingly colored and patterned. Asian fairy bluebird, another very strikingly patterned bird. Males and females are a bit dimorphic, with the males having striking black and blue contrast and bright red eyes, and females being somewhat solid blue with, again, very bright red eyes. And you can't really mistake these birds for anything else in the Northeast. Ruby-cheeked sunbirds are again sunbirds that are found very often in the lowland evergreen forests of Northeast India. And they're quite different from other sunbirds because they have a very short bill and these very green crowns and reddish ear coverts that you can separate them from other sunbirds. The females are also quite unique with their orange throat and yellowish underparts and a very short bill, of course. Crimson sunbirds are some other very common sunbirds in this elevation. Males are striking, completely red and unmistakable, and females also have this curved bill and a little bit of red at the base of the bill, which you can use to tell them apart from others. Black-throated sunbirds as well. The males are very striking with a purplish crown, and the rest of the bird looks very darkish black and maroonish. And females of this species are very, very drab looking with a grayish head and yellowish ochre colored wings. Streak spider hunter, another very large sunbird-looking bird with streaks all over its body, quite unmistakable, and you will actually find it a lot in these lowland evergreen forests while flying through the forest while calling, or you can also find it at some of these fruiting trees and banana trees, which it really loves. So, finally, after you're done birding in these evergreen forest patches and you move on and stop in this extremely unique habitat that you find typically in hill slopes, which is bamboo forest. And the birds you find here are extremely unique. And maybe you guys could quickly tell me about what birds you would expect to find in bamboo forests in Northeast India. Someone says pikelets, parrotbills, babblers. Yes, very interesting bowings. And many of you have guessed right. The first bird I will be talking about is a babbler called the white-hooded babbler, a very striking bird that's found almost entirely in bamboo, and you can immediately identify it by its completely white head and brown back. The juveniles look like slightly different, with orangish heads, might be confused for some parrotbills, but again, the bill looks extremely different from a parrotbill. We have our pale-bill parrotbill, one of the parrotbills that we find in bamboo. A lot of parrotbills seem to love bamboo, and pale-billed seems to be one of them. You can tell them apart from our white-breasted and rufous-headed parrotbill, which is slightly larger, by the blackish-brown top of the eyes, which is immediately very recognizable. And they also have more compact bills. And based on where in the Northeast you're birding, you will either find the white-breasted parrotbill or the rufous-headed parrotbill. So the Dibang River kind of divides the Northeast into the western and eastern parts, where the western parts have the white-breasted parrotbill and the eastern parts have the rufous-headed parrotbill. So you can keep an eye out for those two based on where you're birding. Red-billed scimitar babbler is another very common scimitar babbler in the lower elevations of the Northeast, look out for their completely white bellies and very striking red bills. They're probably the only scimitar babblers in this region with completely white bellies. Pale-headed woodpecker, another very common bird in Northeast India and in these bamboo forests. And this is a woodpecker that's almost completely specialized in bamboo. So when you do see a woodpecker like this with a pale head tapping around in bamboo, you'll be quite sure that you could be very sure that it is a pale-headed parrotbill. You also have your brown-crowned and black-crowned scimitar babblers based on where you're birding in the Northeast. They both have very brownish underparts, but like their name suggests, brown-crowned scimitar babblers have a brownish crown and the black-crowned have an entirely black crown and very striking contrasting colors on their face, which helps you identify them. Black-crowned scimitar babblers are typically restricted to western and central parts of the Northeast, and the brown-crowned you can find in places like Namdapha and Meghalaya and eastern parts of the Northeast. So now you're quite happy with what you've seen and you've decided to move on to the mid-elevation forests between 1200 and 1800 meters. And you drive straight into some really nice patches of mid-elevation rainforests. So same drill, could you tell me what you would expect to find here in your mid-elevation rainforests and how they'd be slightly different from your low elevations? Looking in the chat. Let's see what everyone thinks. People say bulbuls, good guess. What's Togon? Very nice guess. Yes. One bird that's on everybody's list. May I know what altitude will be considered? Oh, well, there's no sharp. I mean, I'm just considering low elevations as, let me go back to the previous slide. 1200 to 1800 meters here for the sake of the presentation. So yeah.
So from YouTube we have
Cochoas, yes,
participants
nice.
saying
Leothrix
nuthatches.
mazonis. Oh yeah, nuthatches. Again, very important birds in. Yes. So let me cover some of the. Many of you again missed the pheasants. The Khalij pheasant would be a very common bird in the Northeast. Again, quite shy. You might see it run across the roads. They're quite abundant in some places where hunting pressures are low. And you can see how strikingly dimorphic the males and females are, with the males being almost completely black with a bit of silver on the tail and red wattles around their face. Females also like quite recognizable with their brown bodies, and again, the red around the face remains. You see a couple of partridges, the hill partridge and rufous-throated partridge in these forests. But again, you're probably a really lucky person if you actually get to see them in real life, because they always keep to the forest cover, never venture out into the open, and you hear them way more often than you see them. So if you do hear like a slowly ascending whistle in mid-elevation forests in the Northeast, it could either be the hill or the rufous-throated partridge, which are both quite abundant in these forests. We have a few higher altitude minivets like the gray-chinned and the short-billed minivet. So the gray-chinned minivet is quite recognizable and easy to ID from the other minivets, because they don't really have those black tones. The males and the females are quite grayish, like the name suggests. The chin can be slightly colored or completely gray, and they look quite different from the other minivets in your region. They look and sound different from the other minivets. We have our short-bill minivet, like the name suggests, have a much shorter bill than the other minivets in the region, and their calls are extremely different. They have a very unique, like a single-pitched whistle that separates them from the other minivets. So even if they're flocking together, if you hear different calls of different minivets, you'll be sure that there are other different species of minivets in a flock. We have two warblers. We discussed the white spectacled and gray-cheeked warbler, which you find a little more lower in the elevations. But when you move up the elevations, you find birds like the whistlers and green-crowned warbler. Now, they do look extremely similar to each other, but the one pointer that differentiates them is that the green-crowned warbler, if you look at the eye ring, it's kind of broken at the back, if you notice. And in the whistler's warbler, it's more or less complete. So that's one immediate feature that you can use to tell them apart, if not by call and song, which are quite different. We have the black-faced warbler, a more higher altitude warbler, and then this one looks quite striking. I don't think you can confuse a black-faced warbler for any other warbler in the region because of its very striking white supercilium and black face, like the name suggests. We have our fantails, our white-throated fantail and yellow-bellied fantail. Again, fantails are almost immediately recognizable. Everyone who has seen it knows how cool their tails are. They just spread out and they're almost always spread while the fantail just moves through the forest. And they very commonly participate in these mixed species bird flocks. So if you see a bunch of birds moving through the forest in this elevation, and a few birds just sticking their tails out, spreading them, dancing around, you will know that they are fantails. We have our skulkers and robins in these elevations too, and one of them would be our lesser shortwing, again found in a range of altitudes, but very common at the mid elevations. Males or females are quite dimorphic, and if you're lucky enough to see them, you can ID them by their very small white supercilium between their beak, bill, and eye. They also sing a lot, so I think you guys might be able to find them more easily if you know how they sound. They rattle off this series of notes in these elevations, which immediately tell you where they are, even though they never emerge. We have our cupwings, very cute birds. They're almost completely round. We have our pygmy cupwing and scaly-breasted cupwing, and the same problem with other robin-like birds in the northeast is that they never venture out into the open, and you'll probably never see them very easily. But you can again immediately detect them by calls. Pygmy cupwings have this very characteristic call that just echoes through the mountains at different places, and these alternating set of whistles that just rise and fall in pitch. Scaly-breasted cupwings have a little more complex call, and they're found slightly higher in altitudes. And if you are lucky enough to see them and compare them with pygmy cupwings, they look less rounded, and the patterning is slightly different. Both these birds also have rufous morphs, where the belly is slightly more brown colored. But we won't really get into that because I don't think we'd have too much time. But yeah, very, very fascinating birds. We have our slaty and grey-bellied teaser. Again, very easy to separate by their songs and slightly easy to separate by their calls, but they do look quite similar. The slaty-bellied and grey-bellied, the shade of grey on their bellies is slightly different, but when they are hopping around in the undergrowth and you barely get any views of them, they're quite difficult to ID, so you might have to identify them purely by their calls and songs. Rufous cibias and grey cibias, two cibias that are very beautiful. I mean, very amazing looking cibias of these mid elevations. The gray cibia is kind of restricted to the southern parts of the northeast, but the rufous cibia is found throughout the northeast. And these birds are so striking that I don't think you can confuse them for anything else. Rusty-fronted bowwings, very common birds in these mixed species flocks in these elevations. You can readily identify them by their crest and the rusty area around their bills, and of course their very long white-tipped tails. So when they fly through the forest, you see these white-tipped tails and their very slender build and size. You can immediately tell that they're bowwings. And like the name suggests, their wings are also quite heavily barred, which can help you tell them apart from other species. We have our nuthatches, very common participants of mixed species flocks. Our beautiful nuthatch, which is extremely aptly named, and our white-tailed nuthatch of medium and high elevations. So the beautiful nuthatch is immediately recognizable. I don't think you can ever confuse this bird with anything else. And it's also much larger than the other nuthatches in the region. So when you see it participating in a mixed species flock, just clambering up these barks of trees like nuthatches usually do, you can readily identify them. The white-tailed nuthatch also has these black eye stripes and chestnut bellies and chestnut-colored belly and cheeks, which you could help separate them from others. Large Niltava. Again, I think I already introduced you to the small Niltava of the lower elevations, but large Niltava, like the name suggests, is basically the small Niltava that's in the way if you increase the size by another 50%. So structurally, they're more robust than the small Niltavas, but males and females are dimorphic, and you can readily identify them again by the bluish shoulder patch even on the females. Rufus Valley Niltava, again, another Niltava of the mid elevations and high elevations, and these Niltavas are immediately recognizable by their orange bellies, which you don't really see in any other Niltava. You do see it in another Niltava, but that's a very rare bird. It's called the vivid Niltava. And the females of this species can again be identified by the white throat patch, which is absent in other Niltavas. You have your Himalayan bluetails in mid elevations, birds that love to spend a lot of time in small clearings in these rainforests. The males are readily identifiable by their very shiny blue colors, and the females are readily identifiable because, unlike the other redstarts and flycatchers in the region that you could confuse them with, they have these bright blue tails and orange patches on both sides. We have our sapphire flycatcher, another mid-elevation tiny flycatcher, but very striking. The females look quite drab brown, but you can identify them by very easily by their structure and call. But the males look very striking blue with this orange patch that runs down their throat. And sapphire flycatchers, though in their non-breeding season, have completely brownish heads, and in transitional plumages you can actually see them with a lot of blue blotches, and you can immediately identify them by that because they look very different from other flycatchers in the region. They're also quite tiny compared to other flycatchers. Scaly thrush, a thrush that's abundant in these elevations, even low elevations and high elevations in the eastern Himalayas, but most abundant here. You can readily identify scaly thrushes by the scales, the scales on their body that's almost throughout, and they can come from in different colors, ranging from a relatively bright bird on the left to quite a dark bird with a lot of darker scales on the right. We have our green kuchua and purple kuchua, again, very striking birds in Northeast India, very sought after birds in mid elevations in the Northeast, and again, very readily recognizable. The green kuchua has a bright bluish head and green body and a lot of patterning on its wings. The purple kuchua looks slightly duller with a bright whitish cap, and the rest of it does look quite purple if you get to see it in good light. We have a lot of minlas, the blue-winged and the red-tailed minla, some common minlas that we have at these elevations. Like the blue-winged minla suggests the blue wings, you can't really go wrong with that. And the red-tailed minla, of course, has a very bright red tail and broad white supercilium that you could use to tell it apart from others. Rufous-winged fulvetters, again, a very common fulvetter on this elevation, and you can immediately tell it by the rufous patch on its wings. And it also has this habit of clambering along the trunks of trees looking for prey like a nuthatch, which you can use to tell it apart. But all of these birds are very common participants in mixed species bird flocks too. We have a yellow-throated fulvetter, which kind of you might confuse for a warbler, but again, it's a skulky bird which has a very bright yellow supercilium with a patterned sort of black blotchy head, which you can help separate it from other fulvetters in the region and some leaf warblers that people say they kind of look like, but structurally, I don't think so at all. We have our golden-breasted fulvetter, which has a very bright yellow belly and silvery head, which is again unmistakable. We have a few more millas, like the chestnut-tailed milla, which, like the name suggests, has a very reddish chestnut tail that's tipped white and also has a bit of black on it. Another very striking bird with an orange crown, black mustachial stripe, and you can't really go wrong with this bird when you see it. We have a Himalayan cutia, which is another dimorphic bird with males having this chestnut-colored back, very dark black head, and a lot of streaking on its breast. Females are slightly different, with the backs being colored very differently. But again, by looking at the structure and the tail, the orangish rufus on the tail, you can tell cutias apart from other birds very easily. We have a whisker and white-naped yubina, mid-elevation yubinas that are quite abundant in mixed species bird flocks and in general in the landscape. The whisker yubina, like the name suggests, has a very blackish stripe along the mustache, which you can use to immediately identify it. And the white-naped yubina also has these white cheek patches and a white nape that you can readily help identify from other yubinas in the region. We have some shrike babblers, the white-browed shrike babbler and the black-headed shrike babbler, both very unmistakable birds and hard to confuse with anything else. The white-browed shrike babbler, of course, has a whitish belly, white brow, and chestnut on its lower back. The black-eared shrike babbler, of course, like its name suggests, does have a black ear, but its most striking feature would probably be the reddish throat and the yellowish belly. The black eared shrike babbler is a very tiny bird that hops along with warblers and mixed species bird flocks, so they might be a little difficult to detect, but you can look out for their calls. They're vocalizing very often. We have our crimson-naped woodpecker, another handsome-looking black and white woodpecker of mid-elevations. And unlike other woodpeckers, they have a quite a plain back, and the white stripes only extends to the lower parts of their wings. The males have a very striking reddish nape. Females have a completely black head, like many of the the black and white woodpeckers in the region. And again, they're quite unmistakable because they have so much streaking on their belly and a lot of reddish on the breast as well. One barbet, which is extremely common in the mid elevations compared to the lower elevations, would be your golden throated barbet. Again, very unmistakable because of its yellow cap, white cheeks, and golden throat. We have some very common bulbuls in these elevations. Your striated bulbul, another handsome looking bird with streaks all over its breast and belly. And our mountain bulbul, another brownish looking bird with a yellowish back. Again, both these bulbuls are quite unmistakable when you see them, and they're always vocalizing, so they're also easy to find. Black-crested bulbul, another unmistakable bulbul of the region. The body is yellow, the head is black, and it has a whitish iris. So there's no way you could mistake this for anything else when you see them moving around in these flocks. We have laughing thrushes in the mid elevations, the scaly and the blue winged. They look quite similar, except for the blue winged laughing thrush that does have a lot. Even when the wings are closed, you can see a hint of blue on their wings that help separate both of them. They also have these striking white eyes. We have our chestnut crowned and black faced laughing thrush. Again, very striking look. The chestnut crowned laughing thrush is a very striking bird with a chestnut colored cap, which is unmistakable. And the black faced also has these white patches and ear coverts with the rest of the black on the face, which you can use to immediately identify them. Even though they're a little difficult to see because they're skulky, they do venture out into the open sometimes. So babblers, the golden babbler and the rufous cap babbler. The rufous cap babbler actually replaces the rufous fronted babbler, which I told you about in the lower elevations. And even though they have very similar vocalizations, you can tell them apart by the slightly more rufusy sides to the face than the whitish face that rufous fronted babbler had. And they both have these nice orange caps, which you can tell them. Golden babbler, again, is completely unmistakable bird in Northeast India, and they both tend to move around with mixed species bird flocks. We have some scimitar babblers of the mid elevations, the streak-breasted and the white-browed scimitar babbler. You can tell them apart quite easily because the streak-breasted, like the name suggests, has a lot of brownish streaking on its breast, while the white-browed has a completely white underbelly. Another amazing bird of these mid-elevation forests, a little biased towards bamboo, would be our slender-billed scimitar babbler. It looks like nothing else in the Northeast. It has this hummingbird-like bill almost, and you find it in these bamboo forests and also in broadleaf evergreen forest in mid and high elevations of the Northeast. Watchtogon, I think someone mentioned this in chat, very sought after, very striking, very beautiful bird, and also quite dimorphic, with the males being reddish and pinkish in color with a blue sort of ring around their eye, and the females also having yellow replaceably. We also have some doves.
Sorry, Ronit, we have 5 more minutes.
Yes, I'll just wrap up very quickly. We have our oriental turtle dove, barred cuckoo dove, again, very immediately recognizable oriental turtle dove by the patch on its throat. And after you've finally finished birding at your mid-elevation rainforest, you stop around some settlements in the mid-elevations. You see some open grassy patches around and think it might be good for some species that you haven't encountered yet. So what could they be? Let's look at them. One of them is the brownish flagged bush warbler, one bird that just loves to hide in these bushes and sing its very characteristic song. So you might identify it very quickly by its song, but they're quite skulky and never venture out in the open for too long. We have a russet bush warbler, again, a bird that's identifiable very easily by its call, but never usually ventures too out into the open. So if you do know how these birds sound, they might be very easy to pick up. Some buntings, like the little and chestnut-eared buntings, do winter in these mid-elevation open countryside habitats. Again, little and chestnut-eared are quite easily recognizable. Chestnut-eared is also quite dimorphic, with the female looking much duller than the male. So these mid-elevation countrysides are also very good areas to look for your swifts and swallows, because you have a good clear view of the sky. And brown-backed needletail is one of them. It's probably the largest swift in the world, and it's aptly named because of the needles on its tail, as you can see in the pic on the right. The pic on the left is a view from below and above. The right on. Blight swift, another bird with a very striking white rump and a scaly belly. And you can immediately recognize it by its very forked tail and also its white rump if you manage to see it from above. Nepal house martin, another house martin with a striking white rump and a black throat, which you can help identify it from everything else that looks similar. Asian house martin, another house martin that does not have a black throat like the Nepal house martin, and is very common flying around in these clearings and forests at mid elevations. Now, and you finally finished birding at your mid elevation, then you're moving on to higher elevations about 2000 meters. Now, as you move about 2000 meters, you notice that the forests grow shorter and more stunted and give way to different forest types like pine and rhododendron. And many of the species that you find here are common between central and western Himalayas in the high altitudes. But there are some very unique high altitude birds in Northeast India that I'll be going over very quickly. And one of them is the Darjeeling woodpecker, another black and white woodpecker, but of very high altitudes in the Northeast. Males have half a red crown and half black, and females have a completely black cap, and both of them have striking reddish vents and very dirty brownish underbellies and a lot of streaking as well. We have two of our high elevation fulvetters, the Manipur fulvetter and the Ludlows or brown-throated fulvetter. I mean, it's called the brown-throated fulvetter, but you can tell it apart from the other fulvetter very easily because of the whitish streaks on its throat. The Manipur fulvetter is a slightly more drab-looking bird, but very easily identifiable by its black supercilium that runs along its back, and it looks kind of bicolored. We have some very beautiful sunbirds in these high elevations. One of them is the fire-tailed sunbird, and one of them is the green-tailed sunbird. And as the name suggests, the males are very easy to tell apart from each other, but the females are a bit tricky. But if you get a good view of the red tail of the female of a fire-tailed sunbird, you know exactly what it is. We have our fire-tailed myzornis, another very striking-looking bird of high elevation rhododendron forest, with almost completely green with a bright red tail and unmistakable. You can't really confuse it with anything else. We have a barbing and a yuhina of the high elevations. The streak-throated barbing, again, like the name suggests, I did tell you about the rusty-fronted barbing of lower elevation that completely vanishes and gives way to the streak-throated barbing at higher altitudes. And as the name suggests, the throat is very heavily streaked, whitish, and the rest of its wings have these beautiful bars on them. The stripe-throated urina, again, as the name suggests, has a very thin black streaks on its throat, which you can help identify it by. Tragopans, again, very sought after birds in the Northeast. The Blythe's tragopan is probably the most common tragopan in the Northeast and found across most of it, and extremely dimorphic. The males look beautiful, they're unmistakable, and the females are kind of a drab brownish in color with black blotches all over their bodies. Again, blood pheasants, another striking looking bird. The male, you can't really confuse it with anything else. They have a bright red face, a reddish breast, and red on the tail. And the females also look quite unique. They have these gray napes that you can tell them by, and you can't really confuse that with any other pheasant in the region. And this brings us to the end of our presentation. I think I might have gone a little over time, but thank you all for attending, and I hope you learned enough to equip yourself with all the tools that you need to start birding in the Northeast. And yeah, I think that's about it. Sorry for the very underwhelming thank you screen. I didn't have enough time to put anything there. But yeah, if you guys have questions, you can throw them at me now.
Thank you, Ronit. It was such a beautiful presentation, and with all the pictures and your information, it feels like we should be traveling to Northeast right away. And I really liked how you explained at different elevations and also gave a glimpse of how these habitats look at different elevations, how the landscape looks like. I think there are just some questions Ashwin has answered, but there's one question.
Oh, nice. Ashwin's doing my work for me. Oh, yes.
Which places, examples would be best for seeing the three different elevations? Is it all across the Northeast Indian states where you see these different elevations?
Yes. I think the southern parts of the Northeast, like in Mizoram and Manipur and all those places, the hills aren't typically that high. I think the highest elevations you would see would be around 2,600. I don't think any of them really touch 3,000 as well. But in a place like Arunachal Pradesh, where you also get parts of the Trans Himalayas, you have places that are even 4,000 meters in altitude. So there is a lot of difference with altitude in the Northeast. And again, your species compositions keep changing as you keep going up. So in the trans-Himalayan parts of Arunachal, say places like Tawang and higher than that, you might see birds that are very common with the central Himalayan high altitudes, which you don't really see in other parts of your Northeast because those elevations simply don't exist. So yeah, and but the lower elevations are and the birds you find in these lower elevations are quite common throughout the Northeast, with some additions and replacements as you keep going eastwards and southwards. And some
Thanks.
birds are a little more common south of the Brahmaputra than they are at the north of the Brahmaputra. That seems to be a very important biogeographic barrier that's separating a lot of species from traversing that gap. So yeah, there might be some species turnover if you cross the Brahmaputra and birds south of that in the northeast.
Thanks, Ronit. There's another question by
Hmm.
Shubha. She's asking, she wants to know about Blight's kingfisher.
Oh, nice. That's one word that I have some expertise with seeing because I spent so much time in Namdapha. So yeah, it's not exactly a common bird in the Northeast, so I didn't cover that in this presentation. But yeah, I think some of the best places would be very dense streams that are very well vegetated on either side in the plains in Northeast India. I don't think it goes up to very high elevations. You'll have to stick to the lower elevations and try to look for them in these for undisturbed forest patches with a decent sized streams running through them. So good places would be right at the base of Eagle Nest along the Eagle Nest Assam border. I can't remember the place. And of course, Namdapha, where there are a few places where you can see them quite reliably.
Thank you, Ronit. I will quickly check if we have any questions in YouTube. Meanwhile,
Mhm.
in the Zoom, if anybody has questions, please, you can unmute yourself and ask your question to Ronit.
Chris says Blythe's kingfisher is very shy, just one location known in Mizoram. Yeah, I would imagine because again, a lot of the forest has been disturbed in the lower elevations in many parts of the Northeast. So these places where the forest is still intact and the water bodies, the rivers that I mean, the streams that flow through them are quite undisturbed, are very far and few in between. So Arunachal Pradesh is probably the best place to see a Blythe's kingfisher in India.
No more questions. I think Praveen is also doing your job answering to some of the comments that are on YouTube. Thank you, Praveen.
Mhm.
And yes, a lot of people are saying that raptors and robins and finches, but yes, it was difficult for Ron.
Yeah, yeah. Oh my
You
God.
could see
That's why the
the speed of
disclaimer.
him. He had to cover all these birds,
So
but
I knew many of you would be upset that I didn't include raptors and owls and a lot of I didn't include any of the cuckoos, in fact, which are like I mean, if you go
yeah.
to the northeastern summers, cuckoos are like such a characteristic of the different elevations of the northeastern hills. But I just didn't have enough time to cover all of this. I had to go so quickly through everything. So yeah, I
Yes.
hope I did some justice to it. But yeah, always quite a bit of room to improve, I guess.
So yeah, to all the
We
participants,
missed
audience,
accenters. So the thing is
yeah.
with accenters, since they're more common in the central and western Himalayas, I didn't really go to touch upon it because they're not a very characteristic feature of the Northeast. Maybe the maroon backed accenter could have been one of them I could have presented, but yeah, seems like something that completely slipped my mind. I've removed entire genuses and raptors and owls, of course, are something I couldn't present at all. When's part two? Oh my God. Maybe we can do rare birds in Northeast India. Yeah, sometime soon, hopefully, or not.
Yeah, we need to do a few more such webinars. We would pester
Mhm.
on it to do that. If anybody has any further questions, you could either drop in the YouTube chat box, YouTube live. This will be live on YouTube, and I'm also this is Ronit's email ID. Maybe Ronit, you can quickly
Oh
type
yeah,
your
I
email
can
ID
type
so
my
we.
email ID if you guys have any questions, queries, even social media if any of you want that.
Yes, and just to let everybody know that this webinar is part of the Great Backyard Bird Count, the GBBC series, and this is our third webinar, and we have a few more webinars coming up. But those who are not aware about this events, we would request you to check the Bird Count India website. And the Great Backyard Bird Count starts on the 14th of February. It's a 4-day global event, and each year India. A lot of Indian birders join this event, and over 200 countries participate. So if you're not aware of it, just visit our event website, and hopefully we'll see a lot of you participating in this website. So thanks once again, Ronit. Thanks, Ashwin. Thanks, Praveen.
Yeah.
And thanks to all the participants on YouTube and Zoom for joining today's session.
Oh, and
And,
finally, one more thing. Someone asks if they can have the presentation. If queries like this, you can just drop me an email and I'll be happy to send them to you. So yeah.
Yeah. All right then. Good evening. Bye.